have you been able to learn about the Chinookan households? You've been looking at the plankhouse and describing the centers of activity for the plankhouse. What are you being able to tell us now about Chinookan household economy?
Well, what we've looked at. Well, the plankhouse. Let me get myself formulated here. Some of the stuff I'll have to cut. The plankhouse itself is an indicator of the nature of the economy. So we've done estimates of the amount of wood in the plankhouses. So again, the Meyer house, which in some respects we understand better because it's simpler. Cathapodal is more complicated in ways. It has somewhere between 55,000 and 75,000 board feet of lumber in it, which is enough for 5 to 7 modern houses. The plankhouses in Cathapodal standing represent probably over 1 million board feet of lumber at any one time. So you have a 400-year-old village in which the wood is being replenished and redone constantly. So there's a constant demand for cedar. And then there's Lewis and Clark's census of the area has 19 villages, not all of them as big as Cathapodal, but you have an ongoing demand for several million board feet of cedar. And then the houses burned, the fires are primarily dug fir. The fires probably burned all the time. There's a whole series of demands. This is why you're getting back to this anthropogenic landscape, but there's a constant demand. And for lumber, one of my students, former student, Ann Gar, estimated farther north on the coast, when you're putting up a plank house, you had to do it in one day. And so she estimated how many people would be required to put up the Meyer house if you had to do it in one day. I will say that I've asked a couple of Chinookan friends of mine if they have any knowledge of that tradition being the case here, and they have said not. But this just gives you a sense of the requirement. Especially keep in mind that the population, the Lewis and Clark estimate of the permanent population of Solvay Island is 3,000 people. If you put up the Meyer house in one day, it would require between 1,400 and 2,000 people. This is including the people who are actually doing the work, the people who are cooking the food. This is based on a couple of ethnographic accounts of the number of people required to put up smaller houses but farther north. So you just sort of go through and calculate it board feet per head and work it out. But imagine a really big barn raising, Amish barn raising. So what that suggests to us, though, is that a real capacity to manage and control labor, to manage and control and get access to a whole range of resources at a pretty large scale. We're talking about something certainly as just in terms of organizationally, something equivalent to a lot of agricultural things. And then we have a lot of information about looking at where artifacts are in houses and things like that, about the way in which who did what, the role of the household lead in production, and all those kinds of things. We have developed a lot of information about that.
So not only it would seem social complexity is indicated, but perhaps some kind of political economy that would allow for the control of labor?
That's an interesting question, because as far as we know, the maximal political unit is the household. So the political economy is in one of these houses, but one of the houses may contain several hundred people. And there were high levels, at least ethno-historically, there were high levels of slavery here, so there's also that source of labor.
If there were enslaved people, there were also then elites who
there were
controlled
there were elites. We found the elites in Cathapodal. We know where they were. The way the houses were organized, as the society and then the houses were organized, was as was typical of the Northwest Coast, where there were two strata of people. There were free people and then there were slaves. And the slaves were war captives or their descendants. Mainly here, war captives. And then above that is a small household elite. And these are people who owe their position to birth and then also to wealth. Farther north, the birth gets more important down here. The wealth capacity to get access to wealth becomes more important, but it's still by birth. And then underneath that is a large group of folks who are kind of elite-ish. They're not really high elite, but they have some of the aspects of being elite. And then underneath that is another sort of rank of people who are free, but they're not really plugged into any of the households and kind of float. And so you clearly have what some people call a proto-class system up and down the coast. And it's here, and it goes all the way up the coast. Goes up river as far as the Dalles. And the elite command a fair amount of authority and prestige, varying from place to place. But a lot of authority, a lot of prestige, a few places maybe power, which to me means you can make people do what they wouldn't otherwise want to do. There are stories in ethnography about Chinook chiefs at the mouth of the river being able to command food in times of famine, which it strikes me as power. So that structure was replicated within at least the large households. There's David Ellis, who's an archaeologist, thinks there may be some houses that are just simply low status houses, small, poor houses. He's excavated a couple of these that often interpreted as seasonal occupations, but he thinks maybe you actually can get small, very low status households. So Meyer and one of the houses at Cathapolo is really, these are big, high status households. One of the ones we excavated at Cathapolo is probably one visited by Lewis and Clark, and by their account, it's got all the sort of trappings that you would expect from a very high status, lower Columbia River house.
So what kind of artifacts would tell you that you have different social classes?
Well,
how are they differentiating?
What we found is nothing in large numbers. Stuff that's costly, material that may be very costly, material that may be very exotic, things that the ethnographic record may tell us are status markers. So for example, at Cathapolo we found one portion of the house, we found things like iron daggers, and that's a big status marker. We also find there's in the way the houses are laid out among these folks is that the back of the house is politically and spiritually charged. Those two things go together, not necessarily, the back of the house is where you get the high status folks, but that's also where the more spiritually charged items will be found. And we found at both Cathapolo and Meyer, at the back of the houses, items that one would expect reflective of things that are spiritually charged. I'm being ambiguous, but carvings. So these aren't rare. These are rare items, but they're the kinds of things that say, okay, this gives us a clue. I could go on and on about the kinds of things archaeologists look for to determine that's high status and this is not high status. One of the things that's interesting about these houses is that the patterns, once we've sort of nailed down where those folks were, the patterns that go with them are very fluid from house to house. There's no, for example, in terms of economy, there are specialists in the houses, but what people are specializing in and what the relationship is between that and status varies from place to place. There are a couple, copperworking seems to be low status, but in general, for example, hunting. At Meyer, land mammal hunting appears to be associated with low status, and Cathapolo it appears to be associated with high status. And one of the things that has driven us nuts is that we haven't been able to come up with real, consistent, predictable patterns from the four houses where we have good samples. So it's interesting. So we get this capacity we're talking about with all the cellars and things, but the organization that may go with that is very fluid. One of the things Elizabeth Sobel, who did her dissertation comparing Cathapolo with a contemporary site upriver that was dug in the 70s at Bonneville, was looking at some of these issues, and she discovered that there's sort of these households have about two or three different. The high status households have about two or three strategies for maintaining their status. One of which is in the sort of traditional economic production, like Meyer, and the other one of which is engagement in trade and exchange. So it's not necessarily one or the other. It's like each household may have, and this is not surprising, each household may have, the elite in each household may have slightly different strategies for building and maintaining their prestige and their status. And we're sort of getting at that archaeologically.
So there's some evidence of accumulation of wealth.
Yeah, not as much as we think. We think that might have to do with abandonment, but yes, there is accumulation of wealth. Both the wealth that we find is actually, we need to make a distinction between trade goods and traditional stuff. Trade goods, like copper, it's all over the place. Things that the written records say, oh, copper is really important, or trade beads, that's a marker of high status. Now we find trade beads everywhere. It's like, oh, if trade beads were a marker of high status, there was a marker of high status for an hour and a half. And copper is very surprising because copper was like gold before, and then people came in and it was everywhere. And so we've suddenly found it's in the house. We're not throwing it away outdoors, but it just shows up in all the nooks and crannies of the house.